Hey guys, Chris here. Today I'm going to review Torment Tides of Numenera, the isometric CRPG recently released by In Exile Entertainment and based on the Numenera tabletop role-playing game. A lot of us were pretty excited when we heard about Tides of Numenera, especially as it was billed as a spiritual successor to the legendary Planescape Torment, and brought together a number of big names who worked on the original Torment. Full disclosure, I personally loved Planescape Torment. It was one of the big, influential CRPGs in my early gaming experience and it had a huge impact on me. That said, I'm fully aware that it was itself very much a flawed gem, and certainly it wouldn't fare so well if judged by modern gaming standards. So how does Torment Tides of Numenera stand up, both compared to its spiritual predecessor and as an independent game in its own right? Unfortunately, I have to say, I don't think it stands up very well at all. It's not a bad game, but it's not a great one either, and it certainly doesn't deserve to hold the title of spiritual successor to Planescape Torment. It's alright, it's okay, and honestly, that's a huge disappointment. Tides of Numenera feels like a mimicry of Planescape Torment that never quite manages to get why its predecessor was so great. It copies some of the form and style of Planescape, but simply doesn't have the substance. It shoehorns in the torment element of the title in a frankly cack-handed way, builds a story that might be compelling but in which your character plays second fiddle, turns what should be an intriguing setting into a muddy, unevocative blur, and implements some of the worst game mechanics I've seen in a while. For me, the game's first stumble comes visually and noticeably. Tides of Numenera is isometric, unsurprising given the renaissance of isometric RPGs we've seen recently, including Pillars of Eternity, the engine which Numenera borrows. This could have worked, except Tides makes some terrible setting choices when the restrictions of isometric are considered. The game starts in a city called Sager's Cliffs, and there's a few pieces of artwork around that depict this rearing, shambolic mess of a city atop these precarious cliffs, with buildings and structures spilling down the drop. And isometric view simply can't carry off that kind of visual effect in a striking way. The game gives barely any sense at all of the height in the design and visuals. It tries to carry it off in the text descriptions, but show don't tell is a thing for a reason. The bloom, an area that's pretty much a glacier made of crawling flesh, should be a colossal horror, but the game struggles to convey the size and scope of it. Worse, the art design is generally a muddy, messy thing. Zoomed out, your party will look like a generic mob of adventurers from any of countless boring CRPGs. There are none of the distinctive designs from Planescape Torment here. If you zoom right in, you can pick out some details that could look really cool, like the tattoos on one of the companion characters, Allergan, but even then you can't get right in close to the sort of setting details that could really make Numenera come alive. The level of graphical detail in Tides of Numenera simply doesn't fare well when exposed to that level of zoomed in scrutiny. Compare it to a game like Xenoclash, a first person viewpoint that really immerses you in the weirdness of its setting. Numenera instead tries to shoulder all that missing visual impact via text in little pop-up descriptions and yet more reels of description during conversation and interaction menus, but it lacks the fundamental underpinning design aesthetic that a game like Planescape or Xenoclash carries off. It's just a mess. The actual game mechanics of Numenera, the game that you play, is its nadir. Genuinely a low point. The system is based around 3 stats of might, speed and intellect that you spend points on to increase in your chances of success at a task. On the one hand, I find that pretty poor from an immersion viewpoint. Why am I less likely to succeed in persuading someone to do something just because I've previously talked to other people? I can kind of see what they're trying to get at, making you consider how to spend limited resources to achieve your goals, but the only times it really works are in a couple of crisis events, more on those later. As soon as you've managed to gather some cash, it simply stops being a problem, as you can rest and make sure your pools are refilled. The game does feature some timed quests to trip you up if you try this, but I only found a couple early on, and once those were done, it just wasn't a problem anymore. By about a third of the way into the game, the mechanics actually became nearly irrelevant to me, due to accruing what the game calls edge via level ups, which gives you a permanent boost to your chances with a given stat. With enough edge, I could pass tests without spending any of my stats at all. Before you get to that point though, intellect is the king of stats. Like Planescape Torment in one way at least, Tides of Numenera heavily favours focusing on social and mental gameplay, all of which are rolled into the intellect stat. This in turn favours the Nano class, the game's equivalent of a wizard, which is made even worse by the fact that the Nano can get this, have a power from the beginning of the game that lets you read minds. Yes, read minds. For a game focused around interaction with other characters, that's huge. It's actually quite cool, but it leaves the warrior-esque glaive and rogue by another name Jack as inferior class choices. One good thing that the game does is that you can get through almost all of it without a fight, which I think is pretty cool. The problem is you can get through almost all of it without a fight, further devaluing the poor glaive class. And you're going to want to do that because the combat system is absolutely terrible. I say combat system, it's called the crisis system and is intended to handle more than just combat. I encountered maybe 2 crisis events in the entire game that actually gave a hint of inXile's greater goal of interesting, multifaceted crises where you would approach them in multiple ways, fighting or talking or other actions in a race against time. 2. Most of them though are just, well, fights, and they're boring. There's virtually no strategy to them. You can't meaningfully set up for a combat because you tend to get dumped into them out of conversations. You can't use stealth abilities outside of combat to creep up on an enemy. You can't use combat focused ciphers, one-shot magic items, outside of combat either. The maps are not designed for tactically interesting layouts, so you can't split your party up and come at a foe from multiple angles. When combat begins, you're dumped into the fight and have to hope your guys are high enough on the initiative chain to give you an opportunity to do anything more meaningful than just attack. And it's easy, almost painfully so. I didn't combat optimize my characters. I didn't bother to engage with the buffs and the debuffs that the ability system wants you to use. It simply wasn't necessary. There was one fight in the entire game that I found hard, and that was ludicrously difficult. The rest were a cakewalk, and a good thing too, because the muddiness of the visual design extends to the combat feedback system. None of the bright, loud, critical hits of Planescape Torment here, or the memorable, cool spell visuals. Combat looks dull, and it's hard to tell what effects are going off, why something is turned resistant to an attack, or if there's anything more worthwhile than just applying as much damage as possible to your enemies as quickly as you can. But for a game like Tides of Numenera, a bad combat system and poor visual design wouldn't necessarily be enough to sink it. This is a game about text, and god, how much text. Reams and reams of verbosity pouring from endless NPCs and bits of description. If the text was well done, Numenera could still be a gem. The text is not well done. Some of it comes from the simple overburdening of information that the text has to convey, given the visuals are a letdown. Every bit of dialogue is buried under what could be cool information from automatically tested skill checks. Perception might give you body language info, lore machinery give you the needed clue to figure out a weird device. The thing is, this happens all the time, laying down yet more info into the text box section of the screen, and that is not well done. It's not well designed as an interface. Leave a conversation and go somewhere else, and you can't scroll back up to that text to double check details. It gets wiped. It's such an utterly unevolved approach to a game that largely delivers itself through that text box. It's old style Infinity Engine dialogue structure, and while that dialogue is often quite good, it's unimaginatively delivered. There's nothing innovative here to the text and interaction. And the quality of the text is very hit and miss. There are some great NPCs in there. I particularly like the excessively honest doctor, but the game tries to ride too much on the weirdness and alienness that it tells you are a key part of the setting. After the dozenth wacky, weird character, they start to blend into one another. The game mistakes gimmicks for depth. The companion characters are a real letdown. There are 6 that I'm aware of, and they are mostly dull as ditch water. The first 2 you encounter are so unappealing that thankfully the game gives you the opportunity to tell them both to sod off when they demand you pick between them. A demand after you've been with them for very little time and have almost no meaningful information to decide based off. The third character is pretty much the personification of generic dashing rogue. The 4th character I encountered probably comes across as lol random if you haven't got the read minds ability, which you should. With that, they are actually quite intriguing, but this is no Planescape Torment. There's no Mort here, no Passionate Anna, no enigmatic Dakon. There's not even an Ignis, who may have been 2-dimensional but certainly looked striking. Some of these characters do bloom a little later on in the story, but it's too little, too late. Muddy visual designs, subdued and unappealing personalities, and game mechanics that basically mean you want to use your party members as stat tanks for whichever attributes you've not specialised in, make them people who happen to be present for your adventure, rather than an exciting cast who really feel like part of what's going on. Now, I'm particularly sore about the genocide, an example of both a great bit of writing and a terrible bit of overall design. The genocide is an NPC you meet with a fantastic backstory to him, it's not clear, but the genocide is the last survivor of an army that attacked Sega's cliffs and was defeated by a major character in the game called the Changing God. It's been trapped ever since, halfway unmoored in time, bitter and waiting for release. And when I met the genocide, I thought, wow, here's an awesome companion. It's totally going to be a companion, right? We're going to get the viewpoint of some ancient grizzled alien warrior, get insight into the strange society it came from that we get these hints about, maybe have some moral and ethical tangles with it over its bizarre philosophy of existence that seems really interesting. No. The cool, interesting, evocative characters are not the ones who will join your party. In the case of the genocide, it's even worse. It suffers from a problem running throughout the game, a sense of incompleteness. The genocide and its people get mentioned quite a few times, building an intriguing picture of the role they had in the Changing God's history. I really thought the game would take us to the broken ruins of their home to see their shattered servant god and plumb the depths of what happened, but it never does. They're just a background element, really talked up, then tossed aside. The game does a lot of that. Fitting, in a way, you play a cast-off, the discarded body of the Changing God, a figure who had far more interesting adventures than you will and is the prime driver of everything that happens. You literally play in his shadow and the game suffers for it. It's an attempt to copy elements of the story of Planescape Torment, but it's not done very well, and it feels too much like just that, a copy, rather than its own new thing. Another incomplete area of the game is the Labyrinth, a sort of psychic construct inside your character's head that's a level in and of itself. Again, I always felt it was the victim of serious cut features. You can affix phantoms of people you encounter in it, gaining benefits, and the first time I did so the game mentioned that watch out, there'd be a limited number of these ties I could forge, except I could happily jam in the psychic fragments of every poor bastard I encountered and who had the option. There were no meaningful choices to be made, no limited storage space. The Labyrinth ends up feeling empty, echoing a place of failed potential that could have been much more. So I've been pretty harsh in this review thus far. And you know, the game isn't terrible. I think it's just heavily buried under poor design decisions, and perhaps a lack of the time needed to polish it up. So are there any parts of the game I do really like? Any elements that are diamonds among the dross? Yes, I have to admit, there are some. There's the genocide I mentioned before, and some very compelling characters like that in the game. Also, I really, really like the mirrors. Now, the mirrors are stored memories. You'll come across these items in the game, mirror casters, and you can enter into them to relive those memories. And the truly brilliant thing about these mirrors is they ditch a lot of the existing structure of the game. They're basically text adventures. They occasionally call for a stat test or a skill, but it's pretty minimal. They use a different screen layout, there's no isometric view or map, there's this text and it's backed up instead with artwork, actual artwork, that's mostly far more evocative than any of the isometric maps you'll encounter in Tides of Numenera. Each mirror is focused as well in a way that the sprawling game doesn't manage elsewhere. They're short, intense stories, and because of their shortness and their nature, you can't fail them. They're about the choices you make. And yeah, those choices might end up in the death of the character in those memories, or they might end up in any number of other outcomes, but they're all just as meaningful. The mirrors also get a bit more experimental and adventurous than the core gameplay, where dialogue is basically about exhausting all the options for information and then taking a skill check. The mirrors are different to that. They aren't about going through a laundry list of options when you're talking to someone and ticking them off one by one. They do more interesting things. One mirror actually has a mini dungeon in it. The mirrors are great, evocative, short, focused, brilliant work. From a more kind of gameplay side, the ciphers are quite interesting. Now, the in-game explanation for ciphers is garbage. Apparently, the previous civilizations that have been built over a billion years made lots of one-shot technological items that when they get close to one another will interact in ways that will probably make you die from magic radiation. But in practice, a lot of games, a lot of CRPGs, especially the ones that Tides of Numenera draws its lineage from, end up with massive piles of expendable magic items sloshing around your inventory. Wands, potions, other things. Ciphers get around that by giving you a limited number of slots for what are one-shot items and making you want to use them to avoid stacking debuffs from increasing numbers. in Tides of Numenera, I made far more use of the ciphers, the game's one-shot items, than I have of potions and other buff items in pretty much any other CRPG I can think of. But in the end, Tides of Numenera doesn't live up to Planescape Torment. It does have its flashes of brilliance, and in some ways that makes its humdrum mediocrity all the worse. It could have been great. Instead, it's just okay. Much as the last cast-off stumbles in the shadow of the changing god, Numenera stumbles in the shadow of Planescape. Now, it's quite notable that Tides seem to have dropped or cut a lot of the additional content that was promised during the Kickstarter. Whole areas, an additional hub city, characters and more besides are missing. One of the key elements of the game, the Tides of Numenera, have about as much depth to their gameplay element as a piece of paper. They're just shallow. In many ways it feels like a victim of crowdfunding, promising far more than it would ultimately be able to deliver. Now, at the time of making this review, I know that inXile have promised to add more cut content back into the game, including a new companion, one of the ones who was cut. Maybe, in time, they'll rebuild Tides of Numenera to be something really special, but I don't think they will. The game is too hampered by the spine of its game mechanics, dragged down by sections of mediocre prose, and too much of its area design is simply uninspired. I'll be honest, there's a lot of other areas I think I could criticise, but this review is already long enough, and I think it would require delving too deeply into spoiler-related territory. Anyway, if I had to give Tides of Numenera a rating out of 5, I'd have to settle on 2.5 stars. I think the greatest lesson this title has is to give us a bit of a lesson on the perils of crowd-funded computer game development and of nostalgia for great games of the past without always understanding what made them great. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this review or found it useful, don't forget to like and subscribe with the buttons below. If you disagree with my opinions, think I'm wrong on any of the points I've made, or would like to offer your own rebuttals, please, by all means, let me know in the comments and I'll happily read what you have to say.